This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Democrats are vowing to continue their probes into President Trump following former special counsel Robert Mueller's testimony on Wednesday, but efforts to impeach the president appear to be fading. Mueller spent 7 hours testifying before the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees about his report on Russian interference in the 2016 election. But the former FBI director offered little new information about his 2-year investigation and refused to answer scores of questions from both Democrats and Republicans. He answered many other questions with just single words.
During the hearing, Robert Mueller rejected Trump's claim the probe was a witch hunt, warned Russia's still actively trying to interfere in U.S. elections, and refused to exonerate President Trump of obstruction of justice. During his opening statement, Mueller laid out some key findings of his report.
First, our investigation found that the Russian government interfered in our election in sweeping and systematic fashion. Second, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired with the Russian government in its election interference activities. We did not address collusion, which is not a legal term. Rather, we focused on whether the evidence was sufficient to charge any member of the campaign with taking part in a criminal conspiracy, and it was not.
House Judiciary Chairman Jerrold Nadler began the questioning of Robert Mueller at Wednesday's hearing.
Director Mueller, the president has repeatedly claimed that your report found there was no obstruction and that it completely and totally exonerated him. But that is not what your report said, is it?
Correct. It is not what the report said.
And now, reading from page 2 of volume 2 of your report that's on the screen, you wrote, quote, "If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment," close quote. Now, does that say there was no obstruction?
No.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the president?
No.
Now, in fact, your report expressly states that it does not exonerate the president.
It does.
And your investigation actually found, quote, "multiple acts by the president that were capable of exerting undue influence over law enforcement investigations, including the Russian interference and obstruction investigations." Is that correct?
Correct.
Robert Mueller responding to a question from House Judiciary Chair Jerrold Nadler. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Ryan Grim, the D.C. bureau chief for The Intercept, author of the new book, We've Got People, From Jesse Jackson to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, The End of Big Money and the Rise of a Movement. Ryan, welcome back to Democracy Now! Your reaction to what took place yesterday in Washington, D.C., the Democrats putting all their eggs in the Mueller basket. Was Mueller time everything it was hyped up to be?
Well, it was strange theater because it was undercut the entire time by this really aggressive insistence by House Democratic leadership and specifically by Speaker Nancy Pelosi that the party not pursue impeachment proceedings. And so the entire time you're kind of watching this unfold, you know in the back of your mind that, well, the party leadership doesn't want to impeach the president. So what exactly is going on here? What is the point almost of what we're being told here? Why are we going back through the Mueller report, if it's not leading toward some type of impeachment proceedings? Because if you read the second volume of the Mueller report, his efforts to obstruct the investigation and his lack of respect for the rule of law that underlied that effort are extraordinary. Like this is somebody who has a dangerous disregard for the rule of law, and that's quite patent, in the Mueller report, and it comes through in Mueller's testimony. Yet at the same time, Democrats don't want to move forward with impeachment proceedings. So it leaves a viewer quite confused about what's actually trying to unfold here.
So what do you think was the Democratic strategy and the Republican strategy in the kind of questioning they put forward? And your response to the fact that Mueller evaded or answered very briefly almost 200 questions?
So my sense of the broader strategy, and I think I've even said this on this program several months ago, that Pelosi kind of wants to run out the clock on this 2-year cycle. So they could have moved for Trump's tax returns. As soon as they won power in the House of Representatives, for instance, they delayed doing that until just now. And the congressional clock has a way of speeding up as it gets closer to the summer. And so, we're very close now to the August recess. And to people who live and work in Capitol Hill, the first August recess in some ways represents kind of the end of the legislative session, because when they come back for September, they'll just have a couple of weeks. Then they've got Thanksgiving, then they've got Christmas, and then all of a sudden people are going to the caucuses in Iowa. And so the entire next year is taken up by a presidential election. So it seemed like the broad strategy was to kind of just slow walk this into the presidential campaign, because Democrats felt like they were kind of ahead, that Trump was on his heels, and that if they pushed too far, if they overreached, there would be a backlash against them. So better to just sit and do nothing and kind of let the next election come to them. But that hasn't unfolded, I think, as well as Democrats had hoped it would.
I want to go to California Democratic Congressmember Ted Lieu questioning former special counsel Robert Mueller.
So to recap what we've heard, we have heard today that the president ordered former White House counsel Don McGahn to fire you. The president ordered Don McGahn to then cover that up and create a false paper trail. And now we've heard the president ordered Corey Lewandowski to tell Jeff Sessions to limit your investigation so that you stop investigating the president. I believe a reasonable person looking at these facts could conclude that all three elements of the crime of obstruction of justice have been met. And I'd like to ask you, the reason, again, that you did not indict Donald Trump is because of OLC opinion stating that you cannot indict a sitting president, correct?
That is correct.
So a few hours later, in the second of the day's hearings, Mueller sought to correct the record.
I want to go back to one thing that was said this morning by Mr. Lieu, who said, and I quote, "You didn't charge the president because of the OLC opinion." That is not the correct way to say it. As we say in the report, and as I said at the opening, we did not reach a determination as to whether the president committed a crime.
So explain the significance of this, Ryan Grimm.
Right. And I think it was Slate that described this back and forth as kind of a metaphor for the entire Mueller proceedings, where you have a huge explosive moment where Mueller essentially says, yes, I agree that he met the elements of the crime of obstruction of justice, and I would have charged him, but for the OLC opinion that says that you cannot charge a sitting president. That's an explosive allegation coming from Mueller saying, no, we found evidence that we could have indicted him, but we didn't because you can't indict a president. And so for an hour or so, Democrats are kind of celebrating that announcement from him. Then he comes before the next committee and says, well, let me clarify that. And this happened over and over the last year and a half. Let me clarify that. We actually didn't come to a determination over whether or not we could charge him even before they get to the OLC opinion. It seemed like what he was saying was that
Office of Legal Counsel.
Right. And it seemed like what he was saying is that even if we had gotten to the place where we decided we could have charged him, then we wouldn't have, but we didn't get to that place. There was contemporaneous reporting that there were prosecutors inside Mueller's team who disagreed on this question. There were some that thought the elements were absolutely there, and there were others who said that they weren't quite there, and that there could be kind of reasonable alternative explanations for Trump's behavior. I think a viewer can make their own judgment on this, because that's the other thing that's so interesting about this is that you have members of Congress and you have Mueller not only talking about a report that is public, but talking about behavior that significantly was carried out in public or was reported on in real time. The New York Times reported that Trump ordered McGahn to fire Mueller. This was known before the report came out, as was a lot of this. And it's also kind of indisputable that he asked McGahn to cover up the fact that he tried to fire Mueller. The other elements are fairly easily met. Did he have intent to subvert the investigation? Did he know there was an investigation underway? Yes and yes. So all the elements, I'm not a lawyer, all the elements seem pretty obviously to be there, but there were some people inside the Mueller team who didn't believe it was there, and so Mueller then had to come out and clarify that, well, actually, we didn't reach a full determination that we could have indicted him for this.
Well, let's go back to the hearing. This is Republican Ken Buck of Colorado questioning Mueller.
But could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the president of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes.
Ethically, under the ethical standards?
Well, I'm not certain because I haven't looked at the ethical standards, but the OLC opinion says that the prosecutor, while he cannot bring a charge against the sitting president, nonetheless can continue the investigation to see if there are any other persons who might be drawn into the conspiracy.
So, Ryan Grimm, your response to that, charging Trump after he leaves office for obstruction of justice?
And this is another Rorschach test for the Mueller investigation. What Mueller appears to be answering is, does the OLC opinion allow a prosecutor to charge the president after he leaves office? And Mueller says yes. And then Mueller specifically says later he's referring to the findings of the Office of Legal Counsel opinion. And that's just a statement of fact. If a president commits a crime and prosecutors have evidence of that crime, then the prosecutor can charge the president after he leaves office. There were people that were hoping that what he meant was that we had the elements of the crime and we're just waiting until he leaves office and then we can charge him. And at one point, Buck kind of refers to Trump, but then he cuts himself off and refers back in general to a vague president. And so it again leaves it open to interpretation of where you think he's heading. But if Mueller had said otherwise, that they didn't conclude that they could charge him before they even got to the OLC opinion, then it seems clear he's talking in general terms. And of course, once a president leaves office, they can be charged. That's why Ford pardoned Nixon, so that he wouldn't be charged after he left office. So, it's either a bombshell or it's just an obvious reading of the law.
Well, let's go to Trump giving his response to the Mueller hearing.
So we had a very good day today, the Republican Party, our country. There was no defense of what Robert Mueller was trying to defend, in all fairness to Robert Mueller. Whether his performance was a bad one or a good one, I think everybody understands that. I think everybody understands what's going on. There was no defense to this ridiculous hoax, this witch hunt that's been going on for a long time.
So Trump was on his way to a campaign rally in West Virginia. Could you respond, Ryan, to what he said? He also said in the same statement that the hearing proved that the Democratic Party is essentially in ruins and that nothing was added to the report itself from the hearing, the 7-hour hearing.
I can't think of anything that was added that we didn't already know, and Democrats may have been hoping, and Democrats were hoping, that Mueller would say that he believed that Trump should be impeached. He wouldn't touch that question. He wouldn't even say when he was asked, when you said earlier that congressional action or there should be other venues for this investigation to be carried out further, what were you referring to? He wouldn't even get into that. So they couldn't get him to speculate further about impeachment, and there weren't a whole lot of new facts that came out. He merely confirmed kind of what was in the report. And so I believe for Trump, he feels like every piece of this that he puts behind him is a win for him. This was the thing that he thought was going to end his presidency. It dogged him for almost 2 years, or more than 2 years now, and if it hasn't killed him, he believes that it has made him stronger.
And he said, of course, that that Mueller was faltering, that he was, tripping, not remembering a lot of the report because it wasn't based on something over the last 2 years, he said. But Ryan Grim, I wanted to end with Puerto Rico. We just see the Puerto Rican governor has announced that he is resigning because of mass protests for almost 2 weeks. You, though, in your book, first revealed an interesting aspect of what's taking place in Puerto Rico, fitting it into democratic politics in the United States. When you said that Tom Perez, head of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, actually won his position based on a deal he made with Puerto Rican Republicans. Can you explain?
Well, the island's partisan politics are extraordinarily scrambled, and Republican and Democrat don't mean the same thing there as they do here, and the parties are more divided along statehood or not statehood, but they still have the basic apparatuses of party structures, and so they have delegates to the Democratic National Committee. This band of statehooders, mostly Republicans, pulled off a coup where they put a tiny announcement in a newspaper that there was going to be a DNC meeting, which satisfied the requirements for a quorum. They all showed up. None of the previous DNC people showed up, and they all elected themselves, mostly Republicans, statehooders, to be the DNC delegates. So then they reached out to Tom Perez and said, look, if you come out for statehood at some point, then we'll give the entire island's DNC votes for DNC chair. He was currently running against Keith Ellison at the time. Ellison later reached out to Luis Gutierrez and said, hey, can you help me, connect me to some people on the island? Gutierrez reached out and found out, whoa, there's been a coup. All of our people have been tossed off. All of these folks are now with Perez. The DNC, for very good reasons, had never in the past come out with a position on statehood. And Perez waited about 6 months after he won the DNC chair race until he officially came out on behalf of statehood. And it was actually him coming out for statehood that was criticized by a former New York City councilwoman who was then called a puta in these Telegram text messages by Rosselló, and that was one of the key things that people were objecting to when those text messages came out. So in a bizarre way, some of it goes back to this strange DNC coup that helped elevate Tom Perez to become DNC chair.
Over the more progressive candidate, Keith Ellison. Well, I want to thank you so much, Ryan Grim, for being with us, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for The Intercept, edited and wrote the introduction to a volume titled The Mueller Papers, also the author of the new book, We've Got People, From Jesse Jackson to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, The End of Big Money and the Rise of a Movement. You can go to democracynow.org for the interview we did with him when the book came out. When we come back, we go to London, where thousands took to the streets yesterday to protest the new Prime Minister Boris Johnson. We'll be back in a minute.